Everybody ready? All right. I'll call the meeting to order. This is our Andover Planning Commission at January 16th, 2018. Roll call. We'll start over here. Stephanie?
Lynn Heath.
Bill Schnauber.
Brian Lindeback.
Gary Israel.
Tyson Bean.
Alex Zarchin.
All right. And we have some minutes from 2017, December 19th. Everybody get a chance to take a look at those and make sure they're in order.
Mr. Chairman, I did, and I move that we approve the minutes from December 19th, 2017.
We have a motion
Second the motion.
and a second by Mr. Israel. And all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes. Okay, we have our committee and staff reports. Les, anything beyond what we see in front of us to report?
No earth-shattering news.
Okay.
Building permits, we ended up the year with about 80 single-family permits, and I think there was 11 duplex permits and 3 sets of townhouse permits. Commercial activity started off really strong in the spring, but just faded through the summer and into the fall.
Okay. Alrighty. I think that brings us to item number 5. We have Andover Unified Development Manual Update from Foster Design Associates, LLC. Like that, what do you have? How far have you gotten? Are we close?
We've made a lot of progress on it. In fact, that's how I'd like to begin. Before I do that, I understand you do have some new members, and help me out who the new members are, please. Okay. Gary, you're very familiar, and Alex, you're a new member then. What is your background a little bit?
As far as...
Well, what do you do?
Okay. I work for Butler Community College here in Andover.
Okay.
I work in their financial aid office.
Okay. Also, I would like to introduce Deborah Foster here, and Deborah has been very instrumental in pulling all this information together for you. She's done the research and things, so if I look over at her, if we go a little bit too deep, I may glance over at her and say, why do we have that information on it? Now, just to give you, especially for those who have not been involved early on, what you see in front of you up on the screen there is something that was done initially. We realized that whatever the adoption process was for each element on the left-hand side of the development manual, that's what was going to guide how you go about getting it done. Because the document would be very difficult to work with as if you were trying to adopt it all at one time. So we had to very quickly realize that it's going to be adopted as different elements on it. So for those of you who haven't seen it, that's this document here. Yes, Les?
David, could you back it up just one step further for Gary and Alex about what we started with and what we're headed for?
Certainly.
140 different documents that are now.
Yeah, we started with a box that was about that big, and it had all of the development documents that Andover works with. And so we took that and broke that down into all the contents that you see on that graphic there, and then figured out the adoption process. We also went back and looked at all of the resolutions, and I think we had like 27 different resolutions that had been done over then a little 20-year period, that those had to all be incorporated into the new text. that was being worked on. So that was a starting point. Les, can you think of some of the other major things that were pulled in?
Well, if you can imagine if a layperson wanted to do a project, if there were 140 independent documents out there, first how you would find those documents, and then to wade through them to know what's applicable. Our goal here was to bring them all together in one location, easily searchable in electronic format. So much of our work in today's society, we connect electronically. It puts all of that at a fingertip. You can find it at our website. You can search it by the word. There will be links within the document so that it's much more user-friendly, not only to the professionals we work with, but to the layperson also. I've repeated to the Fosters at least 100 times that I want my 84-year-old mother to be able to pick up this document and understand what the words mean. Plain English is one of our goals.
Just to follow up on that, what I'd like to do is show you the table of contents and then look at what some specific overall changes have been. But then this evening, what we've sent to you, we didn't want to overload you. We didn't want to send you the whole zoning. We didn't want to send you the whole subdivision regulations. So we've given you the site plan review information, we've given you the sign regulations, and we do want to take a little time to look at definitions. So that's the order that we want to look at these things in. But just to get started, you can see the example of the table of contents there. And to just give you an overall, that first part there, now that we've developed the bulk of all the information that's going to be in the development manual, we can go back through and finish up that first section on it. So that'll be finished up. And staff is working on finishing up some things related to stormwater. They're also finishing up on some information related to codes. And once we have those three things pulled together, we're going to have a full draft document that we can begin to disseminate to everybody. And that's where we're at in terms of final draft and things like that. And your help this evening is a very important step to making all this happen. Just some broad concepts of things. Number one, we had to update information. Not only all those resolutions had to be included, but we also had to went back and look at all the state things that have happened relative to all sorts of various things throughout the zoning. So updates of things, and reorganization was a huge thing for simplification, and we've done that through working on the table of contents there with a goal of making it simple and clarity on it. But I do want to follow up on a little bit what Les was touching upon. It's the concept of making this thing user-friendly. And the plain English has taken a lot of time to go through all of the zoning and get away from the legalese of things, get it into plain English. Same thing with the subdivision regulations, but also site plan review. Another thing is we've gone back through and added a lot of illustrations. That'll be right next to, there's a lot of diagrams and things like that, tables on it. I'm real pleased with the land use and the zoning district matrices that have been developed on that. And if there is some time, we can show some of that to you, but that we'd probably look at a little bit later when we look at zoning. Yeah, and Les touched upon the idea of this being interactive. And for example, Deborah, if you want to just click on one of the table of contents things. She can just show you that within the document here, you'll be able to click on something and go right to a statute. So this thing, not only is it going to be interactive unto itself, So say like a definition or something like that, you can click on it, it'll take you right to the definition. You would be able to click on something that might be a link to a statute, it might be a link to a website, that'll get you right to the information that someone needs to use the document.
So, David, if I, as a business owner, wanted to know if I could put and I'm not great at, what are those flags that are out there, the
Banner.
Blade signs.
blade signs, that's correct. So if I went and said, there's a search place, I put blade sign, it would take me right to it?
Correct, and we also have a table.
Okay.
So not only do you have the information in the text form that goes with the particular information, it's summarized in a text as you can go right to it in terms of, in the zoning district, it might be related to heights and setbacks or something like that, but with signs, it's going to be permissible and that kind of thing.
Great.
Are there any other questions about the overall context of things and how this is being pulled together? Any other questions? Okay. Let's go ahead and look at that 108, the authority.
There it is.
Okay. You should all have received the this section 108. Now that's straight out of the zoning regulations, and it's updated and been plain Englished. The one thing I would point out to you is that this has been through the site plan folks 2 different times. Had meetings with them and really got down to individual words and things like that for clarification. One I think that's of interest is number 5 up there on the right-hand side. Is we realized that they would have situations where 4 members might be present to look at a site plan. And so we just made sure that everybody understood that it was going to take at least 3 votes to approve something like that. Because, let's say we wanted to make sure there were going to be a maximum number of people in a meeting to make sure something was approved. All right. So we did that, and let's see if there's some other things. Deborah, if you want to go on through, just. Another item is, did decide to stay with, we went back and forth on this, but decided to stay with the $10,000 limit in terms of things under that the zoning administrator is going to look at, but anything above the $10,000 figure in value is going to go to the site plan review. All right. Deborah, do you see any other things that jump out at you that we may want to mention to the Planning Commission?
No, the site plan review content stayed very much the same except for the plain English translation, unlike the sign regulations, which changed a great deal.
Well, something else in the site plan review section is we pulled in what were guidelines into the regulations. We developed those regulations back in 1997, Gary?
Somewhere around then.
And we had developed some guidelines over the years. Now they're regulations. So a person doesn't have to go search site plan review and then search guidelines in order to put the puzzle together.
Well, and that was another interesting thing, is that there was a lot of repetition in the documents. It kind of had gotten cumbersome. There was information on parking, landscaping, and so forth, and it got repeated in a whole bunch of different places as guidelines. And so this all synthesized it into the regulations. Deborah, were you starting to say some others?
Just that this part that we're looking at now is just the authorization for site plan review. The site plan review is a second file. Are we ready to go to that?
Yeah, I think you can go right on to that. The checklists, I think, just to kind of jump to that, I just want to point out that the checklists do a very good job of synthesizing everything that is within those, the text on it. So that's going to make it real easy for staff, and particular people that will be using this information. They can use these checklists to get it right. One thing I see there is we've brought in the certificates that will go on the actual documents. I think it's important. We've got owner's certificate that they have to sign the document that they're going to meet the requirements of site plan review. Another thing is getting in there that anything related to maintenance. Let's say they lack landscape maintenance or something related to screening, whether it's an architectural element gets broken or for some reason is damaged. This has in there that they're going to be required to keep that up. So I find it interesting, but anything that's related to the site that is on these site plans is an enforceable element of these regulations. So if someone is not keeping that up, it's the same thing as the architectural requirements, the landscape is. I'm just trying to think of any specific things that have really changed in here. Les, can you think of any broad things that we've altered in it?
No, the site plan was more about just getting it to sync with the rest of the document and how it's adopted and how it's enforced.
I might mention one thing. You'll note there in 3.4.7, that follows the Wichita landscape ordinance. And that was another guideline for this, is to stay generally close to Wichita's to make it easier to use the site plan criteria.
David, where's the section where it talks about the term of the site plan approval, and if it's not built within a certain period of time, whether it's null and void, or if they have to?
I'm very glad you brought that up. This is
Years.
yeah, this is really interesting. The evening, or one of the evenings we met with the site plan folks, is they actually had a site plan case in front of them. And one of the issues that came up is, well, wait a minute, we had done this site plan years ago. And Brian, you know more about it than I do. You want to explain that particular, I'm talking about the one church?
Yeah, I guess in summary, they'd been through, let's say 5 years ago or 6 years ago, and then they wanted to change things, and then they basically were holding there were some statements made that made it appear that if we didn't do this, if the site plan review committee didn't do this, they would revert back to maybe not as a good plan that was maybe already approved. So there was a little bit of horse trading going on that
On US 54.
correct. And so I think it was unclear as to there was some unclarity with regard to procedure and what would be appropriate for if they've already been approved and yet they have never built it, yet they're coming asking for changes. And so that's kind of the setup. So hopefully these new regulations are very articulate on that point.
Yeah, I don't know if Deborah's finding it there, but there's a statement in there, and it specifically mentions, as Gary said, the 5 year.
5 years.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's 3.2.
H2A.
H2A.
What,
Maybe just say
what is the
page.
definition of commencement in that paragraph there?
Well, if you look at it front end, Les, help me if I'm off here, but anything they do to improve the site. You know, if they show up now, generally it's considered, you want to do something like a foundation or something like that. You can't just go up and put the equipment there and say you're commencing. No, you have to do something that's tangible to the property.
Okay.
Did you run across any questions as you were looking at the site plan information? This is probably one of the simpler pieces of the whole working on the document, putting it together.
Well, David, I was just gonna say that having gone through some of the site planning things before, this checklist is wonderful. You know, because it's so well defined that somebody can't come back and say, I didn't know where it was, or that I was supposed to do this, or I was supposed to do that. You never mention it to me. It's in a checklist.
And it goes both ways. It helps staff
Oh,
as well, too. If you do think of a question after we move on, don't hesitate to raise it, but I'd say let's go on to the sign regulations unless Les or Deborah has anything else on site plan.
This was the simple part. I think we need to save our energy for signs.
I'll go ahead and kind of give an introduction on the signage while Deborah's calling that up. There's probably the biggest guiding factor on the sign regulations is the court case Reed versus Town of Gilbert. The decision was made in, I believe it was 2015, I think it was in July. But there's two things to draw from that, just put them in the back of your mind. One is that no current sign regulation can have anything related to content. It has to be what's called content neutral. So you can't call a political sign, okay? Even cosmetology or any kind of, Les, you want to add to that?
Well, the gist of Reed versus Gilbert is that if you have to read the words on the sign, that you have violated a person's rights because it's no longer content neutral. It can say anything within the parameters that are set by time, place, and manner of display. It was landmark, and it made virtually every sign regulation in the United States illegal.
So how do you think about that? And what comes out of it is, and if you'll just remember this, the regulation has to address the time, place, and manner. So if you just remember those three concepts, that's what guided figure out in the whole sign regulation. Now, what does that mean relative to what you had in the past? It means that whole section there in what was Article 7 that introduced all the different types of signs couldn't be used anymore. So we initially went back and looked at, well, maybe we can just tweak what you've already got. So you start out and the whole first part of it's gone because you can't have anything related to content. And so you look through the rest of it and you say, well, it doesn't do a good job of protecting the city. It doesn't do enough for signage. So that is complete rewrite. Start from scratch, all new information on it. And why is that? Signs have changed greatly since the time of when your regulations were done. In fact, you mentioned the blade signs, banner signs, all these. We now have person signs on it. You've got signs that are on vehicles driving around. You have signs that are projected huge on the buildings and things. Well, that all had to be taken into account and put into the document on it. Another thing to, and Deborah, if you want to go to it where we talk about the purpose and intent. Yeah, I'd like to point out, if you'd go to A3 there on the right-hand side, another thing coming out of the court case is that whatever regulation you did, it had to have a government interest. Well, how do you do that in a regulation? Well, in effect, you have to put it into the regulation and define what that government interest is. So if you look at item 3 there, it specifically states that government interest. That does allow you to look at any sign that would advertise unlawful activity, defamation, hate speech, obscene, that kind of thing. So you're setting that up within the regulation to help protect you all from those particular signage issues. Another thing that helped guide this is, as I started to mention, some of the different sign technologies on it. A big one there is in item 2, which is the electronic message centers on it. That was an important one. I'll go ahead and mention, I've got a note in here about monument signs versus pylon signs versus pole signs. Those have been simplified in the sense that anything, and help me out on this, Les, anything under 15 feet is going to be considered a monument sign. And that's regardless of whether it's got a skinny, a couple of pylons or something like that. And anything above that is going to fall into, you'd refer to it as a pylon or a pole sign. Now, reason for that is there's terminology in the industry that we needed to stay with. We couldn't just arbitrarily say a sign above or below 15 feet. But so anyway, changed in technology. Another item that this addresses is enforcement. And it was important to clarify which signs are going to have to get a zoning permit, which are going to need sign permits, and which don't even need to get permits. For example, anything under 6 square feet doesn't need a permit on it. Les, would you go ahead and explain some of the other under the 6 foot, but we've got some others in there, don't we, that
Exempt signs.
yeah, exempt signs. Do you have that there, Deborah, by chance? The exempt, there we go. Yeah.
She's on it now, private signs. If someone has a sign in their backyard that no one else can see, what do we care? It's pretty simple. Address numbers, time and temperature. There are several things that Reed versus Gilbert touched on that made allowances that you could single out that particular message. It was a very narrow, but there are a few things that could be accepted out. Time and temp was one of them. Flags was another. Traffic control devices. Believe it or not, there are those who doubt the government's ability to put out regulatory signs. Stop, yield. And you'll find that there are now, with Reed versus Gilbert and all the scrutiny on signs, there are a lot of attorneys who have the manual on uniform traffic control devices on the shelf in their office. Because across the United States, if it doesn't meet that manual, it's illegal. If you get a speeding ticket and the speed limit sign is not at the required minimum height, or the letter font isn't the right font, you can challenge it and you could win. Official signs, Reed versus Gilbert makes an exception there. That's a little hard to define because it gives exemptions to a lot of authorities. Schools, government, the railroad, a utility company. So that's another one of those. And then the things that are mounted on a vehicle with some restriction.
So an official sign, they could put up any type of sign they really want and call it official. So if it's a school, they could put up any measure of sign.
Right, and that's always been there.
Okay,
No, that's always been there. However, we do have site plan control.
sure. I'm not worried about the school so much. I just thought it was a good example of
Stranger things have happened.
yeah.
Well, one thing that would be, if you look at number 10 there, we spell out those vehicles which would be allowed to have digital signs. And, you know, trucks and things like that, or they're going about town, they're not allowed.
I don't know if you've been to Las Vegas, but the LED signs that we see all over that are standard for the industry, it was a big deal in Las Vegas when they first came out because there was a company who built trucks specifically with LED signs on the bed that were 10 feet high and 20 feet long, and they drove up and down the strip advertising for the casinos.
In full
kind of-
animated vision.
Full animated. I mean, I pulled up to a stop sign one day and there was Tony Braxton on the big board beside me at the stoplight. I've seen those in Wichita. They're out there.
Yeah, I've seen some box trucks with LCDs on the sides of them.
Those are spelled out as being disallowed. Another topic to touch upon is amortization of non-conforming signs. Signs that are permanent. They've got 10 years period of amortization, so that after a 10-year period, a sign that's identified as non-conforming would need to be changed out. And similarly, on hand portable signs or the short-term signs, that's as tight as 1 year.
If you
Does everybody
remember, that
unders-
was one of the goals of the comprehensive plan,
Certainly.
was to get some uniformity to signs.
And the beginning dates are all logged when they take the permit out, then I take it, or?
The non-conformance will start on the day that the new regulations are adopted. So 10 years from that date, anything that's non-conforming needs to be removed.
Right.
Now, one other just kind of similar thought on sign regulation is regulation of temporary signs. And Mark, don't hesitate to weigh in on this. We've got wording in there that on any individual zoning lot, at least 30 days must pass after the expiration of one temporary sign permit before another temporary sign permit may be issued. Now, we've got some other information there about temporary signs are allowed on individual property for a maximum of 60 days during any calendar year. Now, we're working on language. Mark had some good thoughts on getting that language, but Mark or Les, you want to describe exactly the goal that we're working on towards the...
The goal is to make those banner-type signs less desirable. They're now a shorter term. They're only allowed for 60 days. And that's 60 days cumulative in a year. So we've also limited the size of those banner-type temporary signs. They're now 32 square feet, so 1 4x8 is all you get. So in an effort to kind of appease the needs for signage, we have what's called a yard sign that can be there for up to 180 days, which just goes maybe a step further. Instead of 2 T-posts and a rubber tarp strap in the front yard, the yard sign gives a little bit more permanence. It has to be permanently affixed to the ground. It's posts in the ground. It's a piece of plywood that's laminated or some sort of a more durable material. So it's not out there flapping in the breeze every time the wind blows in Kansas. It's, the rain doesn't wash it away. It doesn't fade in the sun, but it can only be there for 180 days. That was the biggest complaint we heard about signs as we went through both comprehensive plan and talking about zoning regulations for signs, was that we were entirely too liberal with temporary signs.
It just feels like our current signage regulations make temporary signs permanent. And all we do is rotate out temporary sign after temporary sign. It's something to consider. I know some business owners who they feel it's a strong part of their business to continually rotate those temporary signs, banner signs particularly, but it doesn't feel like that's the intent of what the regulation ever meant, was just to have a rotation of temporary signs going up on any particular property.
And this eliminates that? I mean, when you say cumulative, one flag, banner blade flag, for example.
There are different allowances for different types. These sign regulations turned out to be very, very complicated.
No doubt.
The typical banner, 32 square feet. Then there are allowances for those yard signs that as the property gets bigger, the sign can get bigger. There can be more of those yard signs, just as though permanent signs, the bigger the property, the bigger the sign that's allowed, the more signs that are allowed.
Well, if they start out with one size and one particular style, and they convert, after 60 days, they convert to something else, does it start all over again, or are they not allowed to?
No, they're only allowed to have a temporary sign for 60 days out of the
Okay.
year.
No matter what that consists of.
There's a category called temporary signs, which has various types of signs in it, including banner signs and yard signs and some other things. And the
there-
whole category is limited.
There are even some variations to a banner sign. I don't know if you've noticed, but now when a business changes, banners are so readily available that they will make banners that slip over the existing sign. Permanent sign. There's a different time allowance for that. Is that 6 months, Deborah, I believe it is?
It's up here, banner signs as interim signs allowed for a maximum of 90
90
days
days.
after the business buys or leases the new location, or until a permanent sign is installed, whichever is less.
Now,
Do you
keep it-
foresee an issue where an owner puts a sign up one day and he says, well, I take it down every other day?
That's the scenario we're in today.
Okay. I mean, so the 60 days now becomes 120 or 180.
60 days.
Okay.
So Les, if I got Gary's Pizza and I put out a yard sign every Monday because I've got specials on pizzas on Mondays, so that's once a week, so that's 52 days, right?
Deborah,
Or-
can you go to that?
Is this what
Yeah,
banner
I
signs are
think
allowed?
so. 60 days. So you could do that, Gary, if you physically removed it every Monday evening and put it back Monday morning, you could have it up for a day.
But then I couldn't do Monday and Wednesday because that would be
Right,
104 days in a year.
right.
How do we enforce that part of it, though?
That will get a little tough. What we intend to do is develop some stickers that go on the back of a banner,
Okay.
so we know when the permit was issued, and we can track it by number, so our inspector can drive by and say, you know what, I think that one has been out for 62 days. He can verify that in the field.
But if he's pulling it up once a week, are our inspectors, how are they gonna keep tabs on that?
We're going to have to do a little legwork
Okay,
as far as temporary signs.
all right.
Our electronic permitting system makes it easier for us. We've been using that for a few years now, where we can take a photo and send that photo to the electronic file, so we could say, we know Gary had his pizza sign up there on Monday, but here's a picture of it up on Wednesday also.
Yeah, and it's not like we've got 16 major streets in Andover that we've got to police.
Just to kind of come back to the overall of the signage section, Deborah, if you go clear back to the very top of it there. Just in going down to the categories, see, the first order of business was looking at, go to the next page, please. Yeah, you can see on the right-hand side there, trying to figure out how the heck to define all these things. And so this is the broadest definitions, let's say, of pulling all these different signs together. But as you can see under these, and I'm trying to remember if there's 8 temporary signs, or I'm trying to remember how many there were, but even under all those categories, there's a whole bunch of different groups of signs. But what I wanted to point out to you is there's a strong logic here of defining what it is that's being regulated. There's a strong look at definitions within the signs, so everybody knows what it is. There's plenty of graphics to very carefully show what you're talking about and what standards you're expecting to meet. For example, what is considered the sign image? Well, you can look at all of these examples and see the red outlines there. That tells you what the sign message area is for someone developing a sign. And again, you can go on down through there, and there's this logic of showing all this information. But then to wrap it up towards the end, we actually pull together what goes on in a district. So if you go on down, Deborah, you take all this background information, and so someone can look at this summary here and determine what's permitted, what's temporary, and so forth of all these different sign types. Now, having said that, that kind of gives you a broad overview of the guts of this, or what's in the sign regulation. Do you have any other questions or comments, Brian?
Yeah, I had a question regarding the sign area, and I think that red outline that you had indicates what your intentions are as far as the sign area. Is that right? Mm-hmm. That's an awfully challenging thing to measure, and I think it's also a hard thing to conceptualize. If you say 100 square feet, well, you try to tell us individually what 100 square feet looks like, and I think it becomes very challenging. I think there ought to be a much more simpler way to measure the sign area, and that's length times width, maybe, or
The
advertising area.
The sign industry would disagree with you. They are very willing to calculate that area to get the most area they can get on their structure.
Yeah,
There's a reference to sign area, sign surface area, which is that simple length times width. But sign message area is a separate thing and regulated separately.
okay, well, I think that's important. We also talked about, in the comp plan about unifying across the lines, if you will, in Sedgwick County. And I think they measure the sign area more of the advertising space. And I think it'd be good to make a distinction here so everybody understands sign area, because it can be a very confusing thing to a lot of people.
Well, like Deborah, I don't know if you can find the surface area definition, but yeah, we clearly, and that was something also that came out of looking at a lot of other examples on this. The majority of examples clearly wanted the area of the message. And as Les mentioned, that's a method to maximize the message. Whereas, also, I think it gives the folks designing these, the industry, a little more flexibility, that they can actually focus on the message and not be concerned about what they're going to cram into the actual surface area. All right.
Brian, the sign surface, or excuse me, the sign message area also only applies to certain types of signs. And all the, for instance, temporary signs and short-term signs are not, you don't have to calculate the sign message area. The entire surface of the sign is considered the sign message area. So it's only awning or canopy signs, wall signs, monument or pole signs, and window signs, where you actually have to calculate the message area separately from the sign area.
So we could have a very large monument with 100 square foot message in the middle of it, and we'd still be okay with that.
There
To
are,
give you an example, the Kansas Medical Center, I think, Deborah, don't you have that as one of your examples?
no, I don't think so. I have the Andover sign as an example.
Kansas Medical Center has a curved wall in front that is probably pushing 100 feet long and 5 or 6 feet high. Well, if you use surface area method, that's 500 square feet. When it just has simple letters and a small logo that say Kansas Medical Center.
Mm-hmm.
It's not obtrusive.
Yeah, if you look at Vornado's building, that one end has a huge Vornado logo on the end. Is that in compliance then? Strike it out in
5%.
minutes if it isn't.
5%, you're gonna have plenty of time to ride that motorcycle now. 5% of the wall area, plus there's a multiplier for the distance that the sign is
That
from the street.
From the street, okay. I didn't do that. That wasn't my design, so.
That's something else we heard from the sign industry, that our regulations were too restrictive when it was applied to a scenario like the Plaza Shopping Center. Shopping center's 150 feet away from the street. But the limitation on signage was the same as if those signs were up at the street. And overall, the sign industry has done a really good job of helping municipalities to understand signage industry.
Mm-hmm.
What's appropriate for a traffic speed or the width of a road, or they even go into the size of letters that a person can read and how many characters a person can read at a given speed or a given distance.
How many times you have to pass by it before you can actually make sense of what it
I've
says?
driven down East Kellogg westbound at least 5,000 times, and I still can't tell you what the messages are on that wall.
All the walls, yeah.
Because your brain can't process it that fast at 60 miles an hour.
Inflatable signs on top of buildings, on top of equipment, is that addressed or we're covered for that?
There are limitations on height
60 days.
and duration.
How about somebody, I've got a roofer coming out, and he's got to pull a permit on my house to do my roof. Does he need to get a permit to put a sign out there saying that he's doing my roof, and how long can it be out there?
He's exempt up to 6 square feet.
Okay.
6 square feet is the typical real estate size sign.
I get this question a lot. Is that counted front or back? And I think it'd be good to make that distinction here in these regulations if we've not already. 3 feet in the industry, I think is if it's wider than 3 feet in depth, then you count both sides. And if it's not, then you just count them as both sides as one side.
That's what we've got basically, is that a double-sided sign is if there's a different sign message area on each sign, then you count the biggest side, but if they're both the same, then you just count them as one sign area, even though it's a two-sided sign.
So that is addressing the depth. I hear you right. Or a different
You're talking about the
message.
3-foot dimension?
Uh-huh.
I don't,
3 feet between faces?
Yeah, so the width, if you will, the depth of the sign. If you have a big, massive sign.
Big massive sign.
Yeah, a big sign with lots of depth.
3 feet by 2 feet.
No, that's just the depth of the sign. So
well, let me make sure I understand. You've got the length,
Well, you
You
got
got
the
the
height,
height.
the width,
and are you
then
talking
the
about
depth
the
would be-
depth
That's
between the two faces? Is that what you're trying to
if it's
talk about?
if it's greater than 3 feet in some municipalities, then it's considered two signs. So you wouldn't add it as one sign if it's a pylon sign or whatever. You would have to count that as, instead of 100 square feet, it's 200 square feet because its
Yeah.
depth is larger. So curious if you have that in here, addressed in here.
Don't think so.
No. I'm glad you're saying this because I don't recall specifically addressing that. I'm glad you're mentioning that. We'll get that clarified. Good thought. Okay. Any other comments, questions?
I've got a question. I have a neighbor on 3 sides of his backyard. He has a sign that faces his side neighbors and his back neighbor. It says something to the effect of, "Stay off the fence, you'll be responsible for any damage." That's on a wrought iron fence.
Is it less than 6 square feet?
Okay. Do you count all 3 of them, though?
Yeah.
Or each one individually?
Individually. If they're less than 6 square
6 feet.
feet, they're exempt.
Okay, he's exempt then. It's just one of my friends lives behind him and says, "That's pretty offensive."
But time, place, and manner. Your friend could put up a 6 square foot sign that says, "Your signs are ugly." And there's nothing we could do about it.
So listen, I probably shouldn't even say this because it'd probably get someone thinking, but if you had a fence and you so chose to plaster it with individual signs that are less than 6 square feet, one could do that.
You're given an allowance on temporary signs. Deborah, can you go to that?
And there's a good example of that one on Allison, right there by the stadium. Somebody has a chain link fence, and they put up a temporary sign that may say, vote in the upcoming election, and it's about 10 feet long and 4 feet tall, but then it's gone after a few days. But then it might show up again later on with a different message on it.
Multiple signage on
That's
fences.
a sign, temporary signs, okay, yeah.
I've forgotten what I'm looking for, Les. What am I looking for?
Yeah, so right, that's why I asked.
Well, the temporary signs are are by specific type, so there's a section on banner signs, on
The,
inflated signs,
the zoning.
and then in each zone.
The zone district regulations. Maximum total sign areas allowed on each zoning lot. This is
So a zoning lot,
district.
that's good.
Temporary signs.
Where you at?
6 square feet per sign. There's no cumulative total of 6 square foot signs.
I think that's something that ought to be clarified.
Yeah.
Sure seems like it.
I sure would think so.
Maximum number of signs on each zoning lot is addressed by zone as well, usually hand-portable, short-term, and temporary signs. So sometimes it's one of each, sometimes it's pick one, but there would be no more than 3 per zoning lot
So you're.
in
you're
most
allowed-
zones.
You're allowed a hand portable sign, which is like A-frame that you set out. A short-term sign, which would be like a real estate sign that's embedded on a post. And a temporary sign on each street frontage,
So that would just be one.
one. But a total of 3 hand portable short-term and temporary signs.
So, okay. So I think we're good.
Have one on each street frontage,
Mhm.
and they can repeat that message in 3 different manners. And each of those manners is limited to 6 square feet.
For a period of 60 days.
No, we've got, because the number of signs.
No, those,
will con-
those are unlimited, aren't
control
they?
that.
If they're under, if they're 6 square feet or less, they're exempt
Then-
from that
Period.
60 days.
Yeah, okay.
What he just said.
How do we get away from some of the little advertising signs that are plastered at every corner in town? That
Well,
appear to be a nuisance to some folks and others don't mind it.
They are a nuisance to me,
Okay,
because right now I don't have an enforcement officer, so it's me who goes out and picks those up.
uh-huh,
I picked 52 of them up one Friday afternoon.
uh-huh.
There are companies, Tyson, you're in the real estate business, you understand, there are companies who are paid to put signs out for other companies, Christmas lights, open house, and I've watched them at 5:30 on Friday with a trailer full of signs, the little 2x3 signs, pull up at the traffic light, jump out, stick a sign on each of the 4 corners. Those aren't allowed. Those are on the street right away. They aren't allowed there.
Okay.
So when I have one of my moments, I take my little SUV and I open the door and I drive around town and I pick up 52 signs in an hour and a half.
And I think it'd be good to make sure that's very articulate and clear to the general public that this is not
It-
something we want to encourage or allow. And so when someone is in violation, you could call them up and say, oh, thanks for your number, and here's how you're in violation.
That's exactly what we do, Brian. We
Okay.
come back to the office and we call them up and say, hey, we're gonna give you a break. This is your first time. You
Okay.
can come get your signs, but if we find them again, there's a $20 redemption fee. Well, the signs only cost $8 to make, so
I,
they learn a lesson.
I think it'd be good to just have a fine structure set up for that. And I know this isn't the place to do that, but maybe council could look into doing that.
In order to have a fine, it requires a trip to municipal court. To use a redemption fee, it's a staff function and we can collected at the window if they choose to come pick up their $8 sign.
I see.
Is there a time period before they're destroyed?
I believe it's 30 days. I don't think we changed that.
Any other good questions on signage? You can see it was a hot topic.
Of all of these regulations that we brought together, this is the section that has the most change. It is virtually written from a blank piece of paper. Because the old regulations, there was just no way to limit them to time, place, and manner. Content
Or to
neutrality.
foresee what was coming down the pike as far as the multitude of options that people have to advertise.
Absolutely. You probably noticed there's about a page on electronic message centers,
Does,
how the brightness is measured.
does our new sign code encourage or discourage billboard signs?
Not allowed.
Not permitted.
Okay, that's pretty discouraging.
That's straightforward.
Okay.
Yeah, and Les, when did we get rid of all the yellow portable signs? I remember they
Old
were,
trailer signs
Yeah.
back in the 90s.
yeah,
Yeah.
they were everywhere, up and down Andover Road and on Central.
I
And we
think-
finally got rid of all of them.
I think 10 years is a little bit lenient on our allowing non-conforming signs to come into compliance.
I'm trying to remember, Les, some of the figures I've read is it takes a minimum of, was it 3 or 5 years to recoup the value of it? And I think, we went from 5, 7, and then landed on the 10 to be lenient. I mean, there's a lot invested in the signs that are out there today.
But-
So, yeah.
There's also,
Particularly now with the electronic signs.
yeah,
We just bought 2 message boards for the amphitheater. They are 10 feet roughly by 13 feet times 2. It's a $120,000 investment. That's notwithstanding the structure that they're mounted to. So you know how quickly that adds up.
yeah. Advertising is number one when it comes to commercial real estate. Visibility advertising, I think it's paramount, in my opinion. But it also needs to be done tastefully and in a orderly manner. So,
Well, one of the main starting points was the yard signs, is making sure that the real estate signs on available lots could stay there for I forgot what we settled on in terms of the period, but they can be there for a while, but we've carefully classified them that would continue to allow that to happen.
We couldn't say a real estate sign, because that would be content, but we can say a sign located on a parcel of land which is for sale or lease. Now, mind you, they can put any content they want on that sign, can't stop them, but we can allow for longer time periods by talking about location as opposed to content.
yeah.
Well, don't hesitate if you do think of some things. This is going to come across your desk one other time here, because you still got to look at the zoning, of which this is a piece of that on it. So you'll get another look at this.
It's on the computer, web, so we can look at it.
We have not put this on the web yet because we haven't adopted it, but we can certainly send you a PDF if you don't want to look at the paper that we provided.
No, it's fine, I just asked.
I've had to learn how to make comments on PDFs. Deborah and I have been sending things back and forth for the last year, and
Yeah,
it's
been there.
time consuming, but it makes it easier for her to make revisions on the fly.
If you do think of something later, please let Les know and he can forward it to me, and I will try to answer and/or incorporate as the case may be.
So would a billboard be a non-conforming sign then in the new regulation?
It's just one of the non-permitted signs. We've got it listed.
It's non-conforming if it's there today,
So we're,
because back in 1997, was it, Gary?
Somewhere around there.
We
if I
changed
can-
those zoning regulations that made billboards non-conforming.
so we're giving them 10 years upon the enactment of this, the billboards need to come down.
Within the city limits.
Certainly, certainly,
Right.
Right.
Still in the county.
certainly.
So right outside city limits, there can be a huge billboard.
That's right.
We've already had that come up a couple times, Gary.
Just to make you long to retire before this comes down, the Supreme Court decision that started all this was a mixed decision. And there will be lawsuits, and these things will change again over the next 5 to 10 years. I'm just absolutely certain. So this all may be revisited periodically, but it was the best we could do with where we are right now on the Reed versus Gilbert decision.
I think we told you when we started this whole ordeal that Reed versus Gilbert was about free speech. It wasn't about commercial speech, but the case bled over into commercial speech. So that was the mass change to sign regulations across the U.S.
That's free speech.
Yes, started over free speech.
Fallout of that is that the regulations in Gilbert actually became more restrictive, much
City of
longer.
Gilbert.
Yeah, the city of Gilbert. So I think it's kind of ironic. You'd think you'd try to simplify, but they just doubled down and made it a tougher regulation. I'm going to shift over to definitions, and just a few comments on definitions. We made a point to combine the definitions so that the subdivision and the zoning definitions are all in one place. Again, trying to simplify things and one resource for that. The challenge, though, related to those definitions was to try to get them to sync up as best as possible with code definitions. And frankly, there's some of them that didn't work well. And so we've had to put some clarity on that so that it's still a zoning definition. But yet we've tried to get it to match up with the code definition as best as possible. This is not in any means trying to supersede code definitions. And those have their separate review process, but in some cases we had to separate out for zoning definitions. Another thing about the definitions is we specifically went back to the state definitions because those, in many instances, for example, in child care facilities and wireless communications, we had to meet those state requirements, and so it made every bit of sense to just go back to those definitions and follow those definitions. I think another thing about the definitions, and you can see right on that first sheet there, is getting some graphics in there. So if something, might be a little bit hard to describe by definition, pictures have been added and some diagrams. Unless there's anything else you would add about definitions?
I think you captured that in that we had to take all of these, again, 140 regulations and try to get common definitions. It was a big job. We spent, 4 meetings and countless hours that Deborah spent. And I think she's done a great job.
Well, let me go ahead and say, you're looking at, in fact, Deborah, you just say how many resources did you go to just pull these various definitions?
other cities' zoning regulations, the American Planning Association's definitions, the state statute definitions, the League of Kansas Municipalities definitions for vehicles are in here. It's periodically one of these fellows will ask me, well, where did that one come from? And I'm like, oh, I don't remember, because there were a lot of sources. And one that came straight out of my zoological background, dog kennel and the definition of dog. I'm already getting questions about that. But that's actually the correct definition from the International Commission on Zoological Nomenclature, because now officially dogs are a subspecies of wolf. And if you don't write your definition that way, it would allow people to have wolves or part wolves in Andover, which I assume you did not want. So that's why your definition reads the way it does right now.
That was one of the definitions that the city attorney sent me a comment back on. He said, why is a dog that's less than 6 months old not a dog? I'll let Deborah answer that.
Well,
For him.
I thought it was clear, but if I need to clarify that it's a puppy, and therefore if somebody owns a dog that has, say, 8 puppies, you don't want to make them have to get rid of 3 of the puppies. So there's an allowance of 6 months for them to find new homes for the babies. Do I need to make that more clear and put the word puppy in there? I certainly can.
Perfectly clear
It
to me.
might, I don't know that it might benefit.
If you did have some time to go through and look at these definitions, I think we've given you plenty of background. And as Les mentioned, we did get some feedback from the city attorney, and there's just a few of them that we're following up on. One being the difference between a tavern and a drinking establishment. At the state level, there's some differences there, so we're going to look at that.
And
But did you all see
group homes
some?
and group homes and
Oh, yeah.
that one we have to
Childcare
talk over with
facilities, those
JT.
Yeah, but did you all see some that you had some questions on or didn't make sense?
Well, you just brought up one that was from the last city council. There isn't a definition for pit bull in here.
No, that's,
Different regulation. That's
Swear.
in the animal ordinance. You can't imagine how much time we spent trying to clarify definitions from the state departments. You know, there are state statutes, but the state statutes allow each department to what they call promulgate regulations. So each department can adopt a set of regulations that they don't put on a website. You can't find them. You try to make a phone call, no one answers. We spent months chasing definitions of group home, daycare center, daycare home. It seemed to be a moving target depending on who you talk to.
Our solution in, for instance, childcare facility is links to the website of the State Department that is supposed to have their definitions on it. But like Les says, from week to week, if you go back to the same website, it may not be there anymore, or the definition may have changed. But rather than having you put those definitions into your adopted regulations, we've just referenced the state definitions and called it good enough.
That's
Well,
pretty smart.
You can see even the definition of different types of canopies. That's different from the old regulations. We had to spell those out.
That took hours, people.
But, you know, in the cases that you've had, can you think of anything that needs some clarification that we might be missing here in terms of a definition?
David, you may remember a case in another municipality where they were building out of containers, shipping containers, Is that anything we need to consider in this,
Oh,
in these
mercy.
regulations?
That would go to the building side of the equation.
I guess as far as definitions, I guess is what I was kind of thinking about in terms of what's acceptable as far as,
We spent a lot of time on tiny homes, on food trucks, but we didn't talk much about shipping container homes. At least not in the definitions.
Would that be under modular or?
probably under modular.
It's actually about building materials,
Oh,
is
okay.
what it boils down to. If a person wants to use those shipping containers, they have to hire an engineer to design the structure, because it's not typical construction methods.
Okay.
I mean, there was actually a case in Wichita on this in particular. That was part of the zoning case. And it had to do with setbacks to allow for use of those. Do you anticipate running into something like that we ought to at least get it defined in here, portable containers?
I don't know if I can anticipate it, but I think if you and I've seen it, it probably wouldn't be a bad thing to at least define it so that when it does come before a body of such as us, that you can at least put a notion of what that is.
You know what you're talking about, yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's the only thought process there is that at least you could look up and see what that means and.
Okay.
I think it's appropriate. I mean, we've gone to that effort on the tiny homes and a couple other things like that, so I think it makes sense.
Well, businesses like Vornado, we have shipping containers out on our property where
Sure.
things are stored because we don't have warehouse space.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody's living in them, we hope.
Right, you haven't built a house out of them.
No.
Or have you connected them together or built multiple stories?
Good.
I see you got something here on RVs. Do you have fifth wheels or anything like that? Or
We have. I had to put in a separate section on vehicles just to keep all the vehicle definitions straight. These were the ones that came from the League of Kansas Municipalities. There you go. Those are how many vehicles are defined in your definitions, and these are all active links, so. And I had to do a little chart of the various vehicles that people live in just to try and figure out what the differences were between them. These are all largely defined in state statute, so the definitions have to be what they have to be. How you regulate them is then up to you.
The police department adopts some regulations each year that are model codes from the League of Municipalities. One is the standard traffic ordinance, which talks about the things you can do on the street, and the other is a uniform public offense code. We've used both of those sets of definitions here, in particular on vehicles. Just for consistency's sake.
I just saw examples down here. It shows a car and a trailer and it shows a RV, but it didn't have a fifth wheel. I didn't know if there was any difference.
That may just be a, let me see.
40 feet long.
Hello. Sorry, a little.
I don't remember there being a distinction between fifth
Well,
wheel or.
It may be one of those also known as a fifth wheel.
Because like in the recreational vehicle, it says a motor vehicle or trailer.
Yeah, I think they
I don't
classify
remember a
as a trailer.
distinction between the two.
Yeah. So a fifth wheel and trailer should be the same. That's something like that.
Like with the sign regulations, if you do think of something, don't hesitate to, email Les and he can get it to us on it. But just kind of coming back to an overall look of things, are you comfortable if we send you both the zoning and the subdivision at the same time? Because that would be kind of the next piece of all of this information. And for example, on the site plan review, you know, it's written in there that you all are charged to make a recommendation to the governing body as to approval. And the governing body does make the final approval of the site plan review criteria, but yet you all need to make a recommendation on it to them. But the remaining bulk of this all lies with you to finalize, and then from there, it's going to go on to the governing body. So you've got a big responsibility here to make sure you're comfortable with all these things relative to you're doing the business as planning commissioners.
I think it makes sense to break up the zoning and the subdivision since they're two probably substantially different documents.
Well, they would be broken up, but the
I
question
know,
is, do
but
we send it all at one
review,
time for you?
review, I think it would, if you do come back and review, I think it'd be good to review the subdivision separate from the zoning, just to help keep everybody's mind separate from those two action items.
Okay. The zoning regulations will have a use matrix and bulk regulation matrices, which we think will make it much easier for you all to look at, for the real estate guys to look at. You go to the matrix if you want to know about a convenience store. You go to the C's in the list and it tells you all the zones that it's allowed in, or a furniture store or a warehouse.
And is it going to be organized by commercial versus residential and so forth?
You can
Two tables, one for commercial and industrial and one for residential, yeah.
Okay.
There's an example.
And he's
go on up to the top and show him there you go.
And those are linked over, Deborah? How do the links work on that table? I can't remember.
I have not activated the links on the tables yet, though they will work like anything else. You will click on it and we'll take you to wherever you need to go next.
Find your use and you determine what zone it's in, and then you go to that category and click on it, and it takes you right to that page in the regulations.
On the iPad, you're gonna provide each one of us, right?
The city council's had iPads for how many years now? I find them very cumbersome for what we do because we work with large documents.
Well, if you do have, again, get something to Les if you got some thoughts, but I would ask, anybody here, Mark, Les, Dana, or Deborah, if you've got any comments you'd like to make before we keep moving forward and get this stuff to you, because we're trying to push on this to get this in place. Anybody have any further comments?
At the end, there is a public hearing on the entire document, correct? Is that in front of the planning commission or the city council, or both?
The
Planning
planning,
commission.
yeah, it would be at the planning commission because they're charged to do that public hearing. But once it goes to the governing body, they're not required to have another public hearing on it. So you all will get to hear all the public comments.
Because we don't have to answer those.
Deaf ear.
Well, I don't know if, I guess item 5 is completed for your evening. I'll let you get back to item number 6 there on the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Great work.
All right, item number 6, we have a subdivision committee election. Who would like to be on the subdivision committee? Do we need to
enough members on it?
Well, we presently have 3. And we need to probably maintain at least 3. So when the 2 don't show up,
So it wouldn't hurt to have 4, huh?
I think that's what I'm saying, is it would be good to have more than,
A potential planning commissioner who I think has accepted it, expressed some interest in doing that, so that could be your 4th.
okay.
Good.
Well, I think we need 2 is what I'm seeing. Dana, is that correct?
We've got 3 listed there.
We currently have 3 members, but Tyson's about to be out of work.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna be retiring.
In another 5 or 10 minutes, he'll be out of a job, so we need to replace him
down to
at
2.
least,
Okay.
to have 3, and then if, at a later date with the 2 new members, if we want to add another, that staff is okay with that.
Thank you.
Lynn, how you doing?
Oh, I've been on it for years. I just have trouble getting off work that early,
I hear you.
5:30. Used to be I could, but
Alex, how you feel about it?
I'm not familiar with the committee, so
Well,
I would need some more information.
it is highly recommended by me that a new person on this committee be on that committee, because you really learn a lot about what we end up doing. And you can sit around and visit and talk, and it's not as formal as what this is, I learned, it made being on this committee a lot easier for me to be on that committee.
When do they meet?
Week before this one.
The second Tuesday of every month at 5:30, if they have an agenda.
If they have an agenda is a key statement, because a lot of times
because
we
that's-
don't have agenda
We-
items, so.
I'd say in the current market, we meet, what, Brian, 3 or 4 times a year?
Yeah,
Yeah.
three to, yeah. About 6 times,
It is at,
We were
Back
busy.
back in the day, we met every month, but
yeah,
Yeah, I've had, that's what I was.
it's not been that way for years, though.
yeah,
But it
so,
is at 5:30, so if that's an issue.
I could do that.
Great.
all right, we have 1. Any other takers?
I don't know that I can commit to a 5:30 on that type of schedule, especially during different times of the year.
And William, will you be joining us?
I will.
Okay,
You the chairman?
Brian.
No. The vice chairman was the chairman the last time of the,
I will accept that position.
of the
There we go.
subdivision.
so William will be chairman, so long as everybody agrees.
Bill will be.
Just Brian.
Just,
Or Brian.
just the 3 of,
And
the
Gary.
3 of us here.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
I mean, how many do you need to have to meet? 3? Is that?
we don't have any operating criteria.
Okay.
But in fairness to the applicant, we'd like to have as much input as possible. Many times we've met with 2 members present.
Well,
you should do it.
I'll go ahead and put mine. I mean, I can't commit that I could be there every time, but I can certainly make the effort to be there at different times of the year. So yes, I'll go ahead and put my name in
Okay,
for the committee.
that would help, because a lot of times certain people can't make it, and so if they can't make it when you can, then vice versa, it'll help.
Okay.
yeah, I think,
They're not very lengthy.
What?
No.
Yeah.
thank you.
Kinda
Thanks,
how I got
sir.
recruited.
We do appreciate that. So,
I wouldn't.
So we have 4 subdivision committee members, which will attend every time. No. No, we'll attend as many times as we can. So all in favor of assigning the subdivision committee members to Gary Israel, Alex Zarkin, myself, and William Schnauber as the chairperson, say aye.
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 All, everybody pass? Okay,
Yes.
good. So that concludes that item. Item number 7, any member items? Pretty quiet.
No, 3 years goes pretty quick. Appreciate it. Met a lot of good people here. Appreciate the opportunity you guys have allowed me to be a part of. And you guys have a good group here. You guys will do well. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Time flies, didn't seem like 3 years.
It really doesn't. It really doesn't. No, it was fun.
Yeah.
Appreciate it, guys.
We appreciate your volunteering to do this for your community, and been really good thing for us as a community. So thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Concur.
Okay, if no other member items, I would call to, we have a motion,
I'll second it.
and a second by William. And all in favor say aye.
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 Thank you.